I'm grateful to all the leaders who have announced new commitments to help us meet the existential threat of climate change. This summit is a start.
World leaders made big promises to fight climate change. The question now is, can they deliver? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Forty leaders from 6 continents participated in the virtual summit on climate change hosted by US President Joe Biden. It was a global call to action, and aggressive new goals for greenhouse gas emissions were announced. For more, we turn now to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. Nathan, what can you tell us about this last day of the summit?
Well, I mean, the first day, Anand, as you just pointed out, was essentially getting countries to commit to as much reduction in carbon emissions as possible. The US doubled down. There were other announcements from Japan. China really tried to allay fears about coal-fired power plants, etc. There are a few that didn't really do that much. But this second day was really about how to get there. Remember, we're trying to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius, and this is very much about innovation and ways to bring countries together. Bill Gates was standing virtually next to President Biden, the founder of Microsoft, and a philanthropist, and a lot of other experts also trying to basically say, look, we can innovate our way out of this, but essentially what it's going to need is government and the private sector coming together. And it's funny that they should mention that, because just as they were talking about that, the Council of Economic Advisors that advised US President Biden here at the White House released a report which essentially said this is what China is doing already. I've got this graph here. I want to bring it up. We simplified it a bit, but this shows market share of China when it comes to sort of climate tech industries. You can see they dominate market share when it comes to wind turbines, when it comes to electric vehicles, when it comes to solar, when it comes to not just the production of lithium batteries, but the supply chain as well. I could go on. And essentially, what this report said is that China is so much far ahead that the US needs to get going. And this was very much how Joe Biden, the US president, framed this 2 days, which is that the US has been absent on climate change, but also it's an opportunity to own the industries of the future and compete with countries like China, but also the European Union, which, let's face it, when the US was asleep for 4 years when it came to climate change, they were forging ahead as well.
Right, and Nathan, of course, as you point out, after 4 years of Donald Trump, the US relationship with allies is in a delicate place.
Yes.
After America First. Can climate change be the topic in which the US can more easily collaborate with other countries?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you saw John Kerry, the special climate envoy for the president, shuttle diplomacy before this summit, he was in India, he was in the European Union. Of course, he was famously in Shanghai, where after the Alaska meeting between US and Chinese diplomats, there was not much room for maneuver. But there was a very strong joint statement, and there's a lot of things that China is doing that the US is very interested in. And even when it comes to Vladimir Putin, which, as you know, the US president called him a killer recently. Well, listen to what he had to say when it comes to climate change.
I'm very heartened by President Putin's call yesterday for the world to collaborate and advance carbon dioxide removal. And the United States looks forward to working with Russia and other countries in that endeavor. It has great promise.
Yeah, I think the problem is not necessarily with competitors like Russia and China. It's actually with allies. You know, there's a lot of suspicion about the US commitment, even though we've had a 180-degree turn on climate change. You know, things could change in 4 years. The infrastructure bill that is going to be put forward by Joe Biden has hundreds of billions of dollars in green funding. Will that get through the Senate? For example. So they're a little bit wary, and I think even though the US want to say, look, by holding this, we are back, we are present again, we want to lead, essentially, countries like China, groupings like the European Union and others have been leading for quite a few years. So there's a little bit of, well, show us, and the US has a lot of catching up to do.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from the White House. Well, to talk more about the fight against climate change, let's bring in our panelists. From Miami, John Englander is an author and climate change expert, and nearby in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, via Skype, Daniel Kreeger is the executive director and founder of the Association of Climate Change Officers. Qinduo Xu is a senior fellow with the Pangoal Institution, joining us from Beijing. And here in Maryland, via Skype, Joel Rubin is the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Welcome to all of you. Daniel Kreeger, let me start with you. You've been studying this for a long time. What do you make of these pledges made at this summit? I mean, some people have called it very ambitious. President Biden pledging to double the cuts in greenhouse gases or greenhouse gas emissions from the 2015 commitment. What's it going to take?
Well, I mean, these markers are certainly in the right direction. We've known for some time now that the commitments, the nationally determined contributions that were being made by countries around the world under the Paris Agreement were not enough, even if they were being implemented as intended. So this is the time to raise the bar on the commitments, but it's also the time to figure out a path forward for implementing successfully and working together. And it's a time to figure out how to overcome some of the divisiveness of a lot of what's been going on around the world, and in particular in the U.S. over the last few years.
And I think, Daniel, we did see that during the summit, didn't we? That countries were prepared to put their differences aside and focus on what's common to them.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge, and it's not a new one. This is not something that came about just in the past few years. There are a number of different administrations around the world, the U.S. included, that have stepped in, stepped out, stepped in, and stepped out. It's really hard to build long-term collaboration and progress where it's really needed. And then, of course, the framework of the Paris Agreement in and of itself really kind of preached an independent set of actions from different nation states, whereas there were structures under the previous regime, under the Kyoto Protocol, that actually incentivized collaboration under that agreement. And so this is that time to try and figure out how to overcome 20-some years of inconsistent collaboration.
Qinduo Xu, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, he also addressed the virtual summit. He focused on China's use of coal, and he said that China would, in his words, strictly control the use of coal during this 5-year plan, and then in the next 5-year plan, it would, as he said, phase it down. How far will this go towards China meeting its goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, obviously, I think there's a national consensus understanding that it's a difficult job, but it's a job that must be done from the top leadership until lower governments over there. As the presidency said, there's a nationwide plan is being drawn up, and also action is being taken, not only at the central government level, but also at the levels, lower levels. And also the industries and state-owned companies, they have their own goal of peaking, basically. It's not completely clear right now. Most people would say it takes China further, like 2 or 3 years, to have a full assessment of how far we can go before we can make new commitments. But right now, I think the target is very clear. That is, we will reduce the reliance on coal. Right now, the portion of coal is for Chinese energy mix is about more than 6-8% or 6-9%. So they are going to reduce it about 1%, nearly 1% a year. That's a basic plan. There's a lot of renewable energy. That's the fact. I think what we need is really mature technology to bring that into the Chinese national grid, power grid, and then to make good use of that renewable energy. It will take some time, but I think if you look at the track record of the Chinese, I would say, execution of a plan, I have no doubt that we'll reach it before 2030. Now people are looking at 2025 about the peaking, at least, of the use of coal or reliance of coal power.
John, one of the biggest threats many countries are facing, of course, is rising sea levels as the polar ice cap melts. And it's something that really grabs the imagination if one thinks about the fact that coastal areas could be flooded by the sea. And you wrote the book on this. The book is called Moving to Higher Ground. Now, What we heard at the virtual summit were promises. Implementation has to follow. But do you get the sense that global leaders now really recognize how serious the challenge is?
And I'm afraid they don't. It's a good start, and I certainly applaud what happened this week, and it's a great first step. But they underestimate the lag time between reducing greenhouse gases, slowing the warming. We already have catastrophic effects from wildfires to high heat days to all of the manifestations of the warmer temperature. But sea level rise, as you suggest, is an insidious one, and frankly, it's unstoppable. We will slow it a bit if we do the right things according to the goals this week, and we really should try with utmost vigor. But even if we meet those goals, even if we limit the warming to another ½ degree Celsius, we've already had 1 degree out of that 1.5 degree budget. So if we can limit the warming to another ½ degree, which will take all of the efforts discussed, sea level rise is still going to continue. In fact, it's going to accelerate. So we have to do 3 things at once. We have to slow the warming with the greenhouse gas reduction. 2 is we have to be more resilient to the kind of extreme weather and fires we're getting now, because they're not going to go away quickly. And we have to begin planning for sea level rise due to the melting of the ice on Greenland and Antarctica, which is accelerating. It's almost doubling every decade right now.
And John, there also appears to be a view or perception that climate change is something that's going to impact us in the future. But it's happening right now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look at the weather headlines from around the world. We've had wildfires from China to California to Australia to Siberia, beyond all records. We're having flooding at every new moon high tide, what we call the king tide sometimes. But with the extreme high tides, the flooding in cities all over the world is getting worse and worse. So we need to be resilient to those things. But the sea level rise is something we have trouble imagining because sea level's been stable for about 6,000 years, most of recorded human history. But it is going to rise. And we know that in geologic history, sea level's been much higher. We have to start planning for sea level rise while we are trying to slow the warming from greenhouse gases and also being more resilient to the weather that can happen in the next couple of years.
Joel, Rubin, looking at the U.S. approach to this, I mean, what a difference an election makes. The former president was a climate change skeptic, and that's putting it really mildly. Now we have President Biden, who's convened this international summit in his first 100 days. We have heard that this is the biggest threat that we face. Is it finally going to get the attention that it needs?
Well, Ireland, it really was a catastrophic 4 years that we had under Donald Trump regarding climate denial and an actual aggressive attempt to undermine and destroy any international cohesion on addressing climate change. So, yes, this past week has been a breath of fresh air. Thank goodness we're getting back onto the path we need to get back onto. But it's gonna take real work. It's going to take Congress getting on board. There is political support now, however, domestically at a level that I've never seen. And I've watched this for over 2 decades, going back to when I came to Washington and worked on energy and climate programs. The politics were awful back then. We saw resolutions after the Kyoto Agreement of a near unanimous, if not actually unanimous, opposition in the Senate to any American participation. So we've come a long way in 2 decades, but it really still is a Democratic base energy that's driving the president. And Republicans are going to have to look at their constituents and explain why these wildfires, why these floods, why these tornadoes that have never occurred before are happening, and try to give them some answer that's based in reality. But that's a tough sell right now with this Republican Party.
Right, and I presume also, Joel, that, we'd have to take a very hard look at this, at the science of this, because at the moment, a lot of the division is ideological, politically ideological, isn't it?
We have to. And, I think the key thing and what we saw today and this week from President Biden is that he's making this an argument about our economy and our security. It's not purely an environmental argument. It's really about the way of life for the American people. That's how he's trying to pitch this and sell it domestically. And the argument that our economy has the opportunity to invest in the technologies of the future is a very potent one. It sells well outside the Beltway, but Republicans in Congress are captured by special interests who don't want to see that change. And so getting that message out into the country, saying that the jobs of the future in energy are in solar energy, they're in wind energy, they're not in coal, they're not in oil extraction. That's really critical. And building that kind of public support for the economic benefits and then security benefits we could talk about as well. But that really is critical for him to put the pressure and the squeeze back on the Republicans here in Washington.
Daniel, this is a bit like the coronavirus pandemic, isn't it? We often hear that no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that's the same thing with climate change. I mean, the developed world is just as vulnerable to the impact of climate change as the developing world is, but it seems that's where the similarity ends, because we've heard from leaders of developing countries that they would need aid. They would need lots of aid to be able to combat this as well. President Biden has talked of an international fund. Will that work? How will it work?
Yeah, this has been at the heart of the international negotiations from day one. The adversarial nature of the negotiations has been on one side of the table those countries who caused historically the greatest contributions to climate change as we're seeing today, versus those who are going to be most afflicted by it. And so, and that was actually the argument that the Trump administration used to pull out of the Paris Agreement, was that the American people shouldn't be paying for it, despite the fact that the American people and the country was historically the largest contributor. The challenge that we have here is that, first of all, there's not enough dollars. There's not enough of any currency for what we're talking about. We're talking about unprecedented transformation. Into the developed world, if you look at the EU and the United States, for example, you're looking at 40% of population living within just a few feet or meters of sea level. That is a massive, massive transformation and vulnerability that has to be addressed. The developed world has some of the resources, but not the political will for that kind of transformation. On the other side, you've got the developing world where they've got different sorts of vulnerability, an inability to be resilient to the extremities of the extremes of these swings, these extreme events, the droughts and the impacts on food production, those and water availability are going to be real factors here, and an inability to overcome it, the lack of infrastructure and the resources to do so. This is a real challenge, and it's going to require all of us to figure out how to come together and make the whole greater than the sum of the parts.
Qinduo Xu, the United States and China are among the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases, and we know that the two countries are deeply divided on a number of issues, but on this issue they are on the same page. How do you see this cooperation moving ahead, going forward?
Well, I think the cooperation will continue, at least in this area, because both sides seem to fully understand, what's at stake. It's not only about the U.S., it's not only about China, it's about the common interests of both countries and the humankind. As the previous speaker pointed out, we are already in the crisis. It's not that the crisis is yet to come. So we need to do something as much as possible. Despite all the pledges, they are political pledges. We need to put that into action, and we need to do more if we can. That's the situation there. So I'm not worried about the further continuous cooperation in this area between China and the U.S. But if you look at the overall relationship of China and the U.S., I would say if they have a better relationship, more stable relationship, that will help their cooperation in this area. Of course, we can say Washington wants to separate or isolate this issue from other issues. Let's say, oh, China and the U.S., let's cooperate in this area only, and then we will confront or even have conflict in other areas. I would say that might work, but they could do better. Let's say if we have a stronger, stable relationship, or we can certainly cooperate more and have more confidence in that area's cooperation.
Joe, looking at the politics of this, are we going to see something of a silo effect in play here, where the United States and China agree that they both have to join hands and do something about climate change, and then all the other stuff that divides them gets put on the side? Is that diplomatically possible, or does it risk, the two sides talking about linkage? If you do this, we'll do that.
Well, certainly in the near term, Anand, this is what it has to be like for the process to go forward in terms of climate cooperation. And I do think that climate cooperation is something that does resonate effectively here in the United States, the idea of China getting on board. And we have to remember, historically, there was an argument in particular in Congress about how China wasn't pulling its weight. It's going to grow, its economy is going to be the biggest carbon emitter, yet it's not investing in the technologies of the future. Well, now, as we're learning and as we're seeing clearly in recent years, that is not the case. It's going in the other direction. That actually defangs some of the negative politics of working with China on climate. Now, how this leads to other issues, other areas, unclear. We had a competition with the Soviet Union for a number of decades, as you know, but we also did engage with the Soviets in the Reagan era and afterwards on reductions of nuclear weapons, which were a global threat as well, while still keeping the pressure on. So we may see this sort of bifurcation, this tension and cooperation walking hand in hand.
You know, Joel, during the Reagan administration, there was a staff person at EPA who negotiated putting an American satellite on a Russian rocket to measure ozone. Steve Anderson, and there was a lot of resistance at the State Department and the White House level, but ultimately, even at the peak of the Cold War, staff in the agency levels were able to figure out how to collaborate to do things that really helped humanity.
John, as Daniel told us a moment ago, sea levels rising would result in the loss of habitable land, and that could lead to the migration of people to higher ground, and it could also result in competition for limited resources. I mean, could that lead to conflict? Could you give us an idea of how difficult it would be to overcome that challenge?
Well, first of all, I think we need to change the tense. It's not would and could, it's will. It will happen. That there's no alternative to sea level rising, probably at least a meter. We could perhaps maintain it at that for a century or so if we do all the right things. But just a meter, even 50 centimeters, which is 1.5 feet to Americans, but just 50 centimeters of sea level rise will put millions displaced around the world, from low-lying nations of Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, but places like Pearl River Delta in China and Shanghai, of course. But these are cities all over the world. Miami, people talk about, Venice, New Orleans. It's 10,000 coastal cities that are flooding more and more. And even if we fully implement the goals of this week, which are commendable, we're going to face rising sea level, and the shoreline is going to move inland a bit. And as Daniel said, I mean, there isn't enough money in the current budgets of the world to fully adapt to this. But the sooner we begin planning for the future with the reality that sea level will rise, the better.
Daniel, one hears very often that the efforts to combat climate change will come at a cost to the economy. I mean, we hear that from people who are opposed to implementing these climate change measures or combating climate change. But President Biden sees it very differently. He talked about that. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
And as we transition to a clean energy future, we must ensure that workers who have thrived in yesterday's and today's industries have as bright a tomorrow in the new industries, as well as in the places where they live, in the communities they have built.
So, Daniel, is this viable? Can someone, say, who's been a miner all his life, be retrained to work in the green economy?
Well, can is not the right question, because there's no choice. We've seen this with the internet. There was a point in time where you didn't need to know how to use a computer to have most jobs in any economy in the world. And today, if you want to be a trash collector for any city in the U.S., you have to have Microsoft Office skills. That's a pretty substantial transformation, at least in recent memory, that we've already undergone. We're going to have to go in that direction, because industries come and go just based on technological innovation. So we've seen that. That's happening. But we also need to have the kinds of education and training programs from childhood age upward, and apprentice programs, re-education programs for those who are in the workforce in industries that are phasing out. But we're going to have to look at this as a workforce transformation paradigm. There are whole new occupations that are going to be coming into play. And there are whole existing occupations, civil engineers, planners, architects, who are all going to have to relearn how to do their work in a changing climate, and one that makes us leaner, adaptive, and resilient over time.
Qinduo Xu, China has taken the lead in many respects in developing green technologies and a green industry. It's invested in electric cars, in renewable sources of energy. What can you tell us about that effort, and what are the lessons in that for the rest of the world?
Well, China, if China can do well in this sector by itself, it will be a great contribution, because China is currently the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emission. And remember this Belt and Road Initiative. If China has this mature technology and also have new regulations about doing this green finance, for example, of the new projects in other countries, so that will have a great impact worldwide. And of course, China will naturally export and share the technology in terms of EV, in terms of other sectors like solar panels, wind turbines, etc. The manufacturing and the export, and also even the manufacturing business in other countries. Yeah. So in that sense, obviously the potential is huge.
Joel, of course, there is going to be opposition to these plans from the fossil fuel industry here in the United States. They have a very powerful lobby, as we are fully aware, in Washington. They fund politicians on Capitol Hill. They also fund the foreign policy establishment here. Can they be persuaded under the circumstances that it's time to change?
Well, you bet they're going to be formidable, and they always are, and they're certainly going to have control of a variety of members of Congress. But going back to some of the discussion earlier about jobs and transformation, the same thing goes for these companies. They're energy companies at the end of the day. Do they want to live, or do they want to die? Do they want to see their product phased out over time and have nothing to replace it? Probably not. So we are looking at green investments by many fossil companies. There's a significant economic incentive. Trillions of dollars are being discussed as potentially being invested in the capital markets into new technology. So hopefully that will pull them out of the darkness and make them motivate and make them move. But you're right, there will be roadblocks in the near term coming from oil-rich states. And I think this is critical, that we have to make sure that we're bringing our economy towards the future and bringing everybody with us. And that's a critical part of President Biden's messaging. He talks about that a lot. Training, jobs, good union jobs, he also said today, and trying to put the pressure on the holdouts that they need to change with the times.
All right, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.